My name's Andy. I'm 29 years old. And if you asked anyone in my family to describe me growing up, they'd probably say something like quiet, reliable, maybe a little boring. I was never the star of the show, not compared to my cousin Nathan. He was the golden boy, the one everyone doted on. From the moment he was born, the kid had everything. Brand new cars the second he got his license, private schools with tuition fees that could cover a small mortgage, vacations to Europe while the rest of us were stuck at home. I used to sit at family dinners and just watch him soak up the attention, bragging about his newest gadget or trip, while the adults nodded approvingly like he was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was working odd jobs after school just to save up for a beat-up secondhand Honda. The contrast between us was obvious to everyone, and honestly, it stung. I'd hear my aunt boasting about Nathan's potential, while my own parents gave me those quiet, forced smiles that screamed, "We wish we could say the same." I wasn't angry about what Nathan had. I didn't want his flashy cars or his designer sneakers, but I couldn't help noticing the double standard. He could fail a class, and it was brushed off as just a phase. I'd pull a B plus instead of an A, and suddenly I wasn't applying myself. By the time I got to college, I learned to stay in my lane. I worked, studied, and kept my head down. My parents didn't pay my tuition, and scholarships only stretched so far, so I juggled jobs. I'd come home exhausted, sometimes missing family events because I couldn't afford to lose a shift. And you know what the running joke became at those gatherings? Oh, Andy's too busy working at the grocery store to join us. My aunt laughed the loudest at that one, clinking her wine glass while Nathan recounted stories from his study abroad semester in Paris. But while they thought I was just barely scraping by, something else was happening quietly in the background. I'd stumbled into an internship at a small finance firm, the kind of place nobody brags about because it's not flashy. I kept at it, learned everything I could, and built connections. One opportunity led to another, and before I even graduated, I was making moves in a field where patience and strategy mattered more than quick results. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't say a word, because I knew in my family, any success I had would either be dismissed or treated like a fluke compared to Nathan's destiny. Fast forward to Thanksgiving this year. I'd been dreading it for weeks, but I showed up because, well, that's what you do. The house smelled like turkey and cinnamon candles. Kids were running around, and there was Nathan holding court at the dining table. He had everyone's attention, as usual, telling some story about his networking trip in Miami, though we all knew his parents had footed the bill. I sat quietly at the corner, sipping my drink, trying to avoid the spotlight. Then, out of nowhere, the conversation shifted. My aunt asked about my job, her tone dripping with that condescending curiosity she always reserved for me. "So, Andy, are you still, what was it again? Doing paperwork somewhere?" The table chuckled. Nathan smirked. I forced a smile, the kind you use when you know there's no point correcting someone who's already decided what you're worth. I said something vague, like, "Yeah, I'm keeping busy." That should have been the end of it. But Nathan leaned back, loud enough for everyone to hear, and said, "Come on, man, you can tell us. It's not like you're hiding some secret empire." He laughed. Everyone else laughed too. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. For years I'd swallowed their mockery, their low expectations, their smug little digs. But sitting there, listening to my cousin with his perfect hair and smug grin dismiss me in front of everyone, I realized, why was I still letting them treat me this way? Why was I protecting their image of me, pretending to be the underachiever they thought I was? I don't even remember the exact words I used, but I remember the silence that followed. The laughter cut off mid-chuckle, forks clinked against plates, and my aunt's face went pale. My dad just stared, wide-eyed, like he couldn't process what I'd just said. And Nathan? His smirk cracked, replaced by something I'd never seen on his face before, pure, raw panic. I hadn't planned to say it. I hadn't planned to reveal anything that night. But once it was out, once they knew the truth, there was no taking it back. And the fallout? Let's just say, Thanksgiving dinner was never going to be the same again. The silence after I spoke at that table hung in the air like heavy smoke, choking out all the laughter. I hadn't even shouted. I wasn't dramatic. I just laid out the truth in a simple, matter-of-fact way. Something along the lines of, "I've actually done all right. The business I've built is valued around $30 million now. No bragging, no gloating, just a quiet truth I'd kept hidden." And that quiet truth was like a grenade tossed into the middle of our Thanksgiving dinner. For a few seconds, you could almost hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My aunt's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Nathan's girlfriend, who had been leaning on his shoulder while giggling at his jokes, pulled back slightly, as if she'd just realized she might be betting on the wrong horse. My dad's jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. And Nathan's face twisted in a way I'll never forget. He laughed, but it was forced, brittle, like glass about to crack. "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "Andy, come on, you don't have to exaggerate for attention." The problem was, I wasn't exaggerating. And from the look in my aunt's eyes, sharp, calculating, like a hawk, she knew I wasn't lying. From that moment on, the entire energy of the room shifted. Thanksgiving had always been Nathan's stage, but now, suddenly, I'd stolen the spotlight without even trying. And he couldn't stand it. The questions started trickling in, cautious at first, then more direct. My uncle leaned forward. "Wait, 30 million? In what?" My younger cousins whispered to each other. My aunt snapped. "Are you being serious right now?" She sounded less impressed and more suspicious, almost offended, like my success was some kind of personal insult to her parenting. I shrugged and said, "I don't like to brag about it, but yes. I've worked hard, built a business, made the right investments. That's where I am now. That should have been it." We could have moved on to pie and football, but Nathan wasn't going to let it slide. His voice rose, sharp, almost desperate. "You mean to tell me you somehow made $30 million while I've been busting my back in grad school and internships? That doesn't even make sense." I wanted to laugh. Busting his back? The kid had been handed everything on a silver platter. He'd switched majors twice, burned through his parents' money, and landed internships through my uncle's connections. I'd seen his hard work, posting selfies from rooftops in Miami and designer dinners in New York. But I didn't laugh. I just looked at him and said, "It makes sense if you're not wasting every opportunity you're given." That was when the gloves came off. My aunt leaned in like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. "And where exactly did this money come from, Andy? Because, forgive me, but it's very unusual for someone your age to just stumble into that kind of wealth." Her tone carried the same weight it had when I was a kid, and she used to scold me for not eating my vegetables. Except now, it was dripping with disbelief. I explained as calmly as I could, outlining the basics of what I'd done: finance, tech investments, reinvesting profits. I didn't give them details, they didn't deserve those, but enough so they knew it wasn't some fluke or lottery win. Nathan shook his head the whole time, muttering under his breath. At one point, he said loudly, "He's lying. There's no way." And then he turned to my dad, looking for backup. "Tell him, Uncle Jim. You don't believe this, do you?" But my dad didn't say anything. He just sat there, stiff, his face unreadable. That silence hurt more than Nathan's outburst. For years, I'd been desperate for his approval, his acknowledgement, and now that I'd finally proven myself beyond question, he sat there like a statue. That's when the real manipulation began. My aunt shifted gears, her tone softening, but in that insincere, practiced way she used whenever she wanted something. "Well, Andy, if this is true, then you should be proud. Truly. Families should always support each other, especially in times of, well, financial need." There it was. The angle. I could almost see the cogs turning in her head. If I really had 30 million, then suddenly I wasn't just the ignored cousin. I was a resource, a wallet. She didn't even wait before diving in. "Nathan has been working so hard to get through school, and things haven't been easy for him. You could really give him a boost, help him achieve his dreams. Isn't that what family does?" I couldn't believe it. Not 10 minutes earlier, they'd been mocking me for doing paperwork somewhere. And now she was openly suggesting I bankroll her son. Nathan's head shot up, eyes wide, like he hadn't expected her to be so blatant. But then he smirked and leaned into it. "Yeah, Andy. I mean, if you've got that much, helping out your cousin would be the right thing to do. It's not like you even need all that money." The entitlement in his voice made my skin crawl. I said nothing. I just sat there, swirling my drink, listening to them pitch this absurd narrative where I somehow owed Nathan for his years of luxury. My aunt kept going, saying things like, "Think about how much it would mean to your father to see his sons succeed together." Even though Nathan wasn't her son, she was dragging my dad into it, trying to guilt me into agreeing. My mom chimed in too, carefully at first, then with more insistence. Andy, maybe just listen. Your cousin has always looked up to you. A bald-faced lie. But she said it with such conviction that others at the table nodded along. This could bring the family closer. Meanwhile, Nathan sat back with his arms crossed, smirking like the outcome was already decided. And my dad? He still said nothing. The tension kept climbing. Every bite of food after that felt heavy, tasteless. My younger cousins whispered, clearly excited by the drama. Nathan's girlfriend avoided eye contact with me altogether, probably embarrassed by how desperate he looked. My aunt, though, she doubled down. It's not even about the money. It's about family legacy. Imagine what your grandfather would say if he knew you had the means to lift everyone up. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting Nathan's ego. I was up against a whole system of favoritism and entitlement that had been ingrained in this family for decades. They weren't proud of me. They weren't happy for me. They were circling, like vultures, waiting to pick at whatever scraps they thought I might toss their way. Every word out of their mouths made the air heavier. I could feel Nathan's jealousy boiling, his need to prove that even with all my success, he was still the star. And I could feel my aunt's greed wrapping around the table like vines, squeezing, pressing me to commit to something I hadn't even agreed to. By the time dessert was served, it wasn't a celebration anymore. It was a tribunal. I was no longer Andy, the quiet cousin who worked too much. I was Andy, the guy with 30 million, and in their eyes, that meant I was no longer family. I was an asset to be exploited. And as Nathan's voice grew louder, as my aunt's tone turned sharper, as my dad sat frozen in his silence, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving dinner. This was the start of a war. I left that table with my chest tight and my hands clenched under the napkin. I knew what was coming next, and it wasn't going to be pretty. The weeks after that Thanksgiving dinner felt like I was living in some alternate reality. Normally, the family would scatter back into their own routines, and I wouldn't hear from most of them until Christmas, maybe the occasional forwarded text about a birthday or a group chat joke. But this time was different. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. My phone, usually quiet, started buzzing constantly. My aunt, who hadn't texted me in months unless it was a reminder to bring dessert to a gathering, was now sending me cheerful little messages. "Good morning, Andy. Hope you're doing well. Nathan was just talking about his plans for graduate school. So exciting. Maybe we can sit down and chat about how you could help him get started." Always with that sugary tone, but underneath it was the same sharp pressure. Give, give, give. My cousins, the ones who used to snicker at me when I pulled up in my dented old Honda, suddenly wanted to hang out. They'd never invited me to parties before, but now they were tagging me in posts, sending me links to fun investment opportunities, and hinting at vacations we could take as a family. But the worst part? My dad. For years, he'd been the quiet one, never outright cruel like my aunt, but never supportive either. He was the man of silence, the one whose approval I kept chasing like a carrot on a stick. And after Thanksgiving, I thought maybe, just maybe, the revelation of what I'd built would change things between us. I thought he'd look at me differently, maybe even tell me he was proud. Instead, he began acting like my success had been his idea all along. I'll never forget one Sunday dinner when he said, in front of everyone, "Andy always listened to my advice about money. That's why he's done so well." My fork nearly slipped from my hand. His advice? The man who used to tell me, "Don't take risks, just get a stable job, keep your head down." The same man who scolded me when I turned down an office job with benefits because I wanted to keep working on my business? Now, he was rewriting history so that my achievements looked like his legacy. I bit my tongue, but inside, a knot formed. And then came the betrayal. It started small, like the kind of thing you almost convince yourself you imagined. A cousin posting on Facebook about our family's success and tagging me in photos I'd never agreed to share. My aunt bragging at church about how her nephew is going to change Nathan's life. But then, one Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from a bank manager. "Hi, is this Andrew?" the man asked. "I just wanted to confirm some information regarding the joint account your father applied to open with you listed as the primary." I froze. "I'm sorry, what?" The man repeated it. My father had gone into a bank, tried to open an account with both our names, using my information. He must have gotten some of my details from old paperwork or conversations. My chest went tight, heat creeping up my neck. "No," I said firmly. "I did not authorize that. Cancel it immediately." The manager apologized, said nothing had been processed yet, but the implication was enough to rattle me. My own father had tried to tie his finances directly to mine, without asking, without even mentioning it. I didn't confront him right away. I needed time to breathe, to think. But the hits kept coming. 2 days later, I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. "Hey, man, just checking in. Your cousin Nathan reached out to me about this business thing. Is that legit?" My heart sank. I asked what Nathan had said, and my friend explained. Nathan had been contacting people in my network, using my name, dropping it casually into conversations, acting as though he was connected to my deals. Worse, he'd pitched a few people on investment opportunities and implied I was involved. I was furious. That wasn't just disrespect. That was dangerous. My reputation, my credibility, built brick by brick over years of grinding, and Nathan was using it like a toy. When I finally confronted him, he didn't even flinch. "Come on, Andy," he said with that smug grin. "I was just trying to get some momentum. People trust you, so why not? We're family. Your success is my success, right?" I wanted to scream at him, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just stared at him, trying to understand how he could believe what he was saying. But then I realized it wasn't just him. It was the entire family culture. They'd spent years treating me like the backup, the invisible one, and now that I had something they wanted, they saw no boundaries. It escalated quickly after that. My aunt hosted a dinner where she paraded Nathan around, talking about his bright future and how, with Andy's help, he'll finally achieve everything he deserves. She said it like it was a done deal, like my money was already earmarked for him. People clapped. Nathan beamed. And I sat there, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. But the final straw came a week later. I walked into my parents' house to find my dad and aunt sitting at the table with a stack of papers. Legal documents. They tried to play it off like a casual conversation, but when I pressed, they revealed the truth. They'd been drafting some kind of family trust, with my assets at the center. Without telling me, without asking me, they had already talked to a lawyer. "Andy," my aunt said smoothly, "this is for everyone's benefit. You don't want to isolate yourself, do you? Family takes care of each other. This way, your wealth will create security for generations." Nathan was leaning against the wall, arms folded, grinning like a cat who'd just lapped up cream. My father didn't look at me. He just cleared his throat and said, "It's the right thing to do, son. You've been blessed. Don't be selfish." Selfish. The word landed like a knife. After years of working in silence, years of being dismissed, mocked, ignored, suddenly I was selfish because I didn't want to hand over the blood, sweat, and sleepless nights I'd poured into building something of my own. I remember staring at the papers, the room swimming around me. My hands shook, but not from fear, from rage. My own family had conspired behind my back to take control of everything I had built. They weren't even hiding it anymore. That was the moment something inside me broke. The trust, the little thread of loyalty I'd been clinging to, it snapped clean in two. I looked at their faces, my aunt's calculating smile, Nathan's smug satisfaction, my father's cold silence, and I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't go back. And that night, as I sat alone, staring at the ceiling, one thought played over and over in my mind. They had no idea what was coming next. I don't think I've ever felt as hollow as I did after that night at my parents' house. Driving home, the roads blurred past me, the headlights of other cars streaking like white ghosts in the dark. I don't even remember the turns I took. I must have been running on autopilot. All I know is that when I finally stepped into my apartment, I sank onto the couch and just sat there, staring at nothing. It was the silence that got to me. My place was usually a sanctuary, quiet by design, but that night it pressed in on me, suffocating. The only sounds were the hum of the fridge and my own shallow breathing. I'd always known my family could be dismissive, even cruel at times, but what I'd witnessed, the papers on the table, the trust they'd drafted without me, it was like a mask had been ripped off, showing me the truth I'd been too naive to see. They didn't just envy me. They didn't just want to ride my coattails. They were willing to cut me out of my own life if it meant securing their piece of what I had built. That realization broke something inside me. For years, I'd carried around this quiet hope that maybe one day, if I worked hard enough, if I made something of myself, they'd see me differently. That my dad would finally look at me and say, "I'm proud of you." That my aunt would stop comparing me to Nathan and admit that I'd earned my place. I believed, foolishly, that family was something you could fix if you just tried hard enough. But staring at the ceiling that night, I realized I'd been chasing smoke. The days that followed felt like moving through quicksand. Work, which had always been my anchor, suddenly felt heavier. I'd sit in front of my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to focus. Calls came in, deals needed my attention, but my mind kept drifting back to their faces, the way they looked at me like I wasn't a person anymore, just a bank account with legs. I stopped answering their messages. The family group chat, usually buzzing with memes and updates about birthdays or random gossip, became unbearable to even glance at. Every ping made my stomach knot. My aunt kept sending me reminders about the trust, phrased like casual nudges. We should finalize things soon, Andy. The lawyer is waiting. Nathan, emboldened by the silence, sent smug little texts like, "Thanks for finally stepping up, man. This is going to change everything for me." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I withdrew. I'd come home from work, drop my bag, and collapse into bed without eating. My appetite vanished. Sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams where I'd walk into a room and see my family rifling through my belongings, grinning as they counted stacks of money that weren't even there. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, my hands trembling. It was the lowest I'd felt in years. One night, about a week later, I found myself pacing the apartment at 3 a.m., the city outside muffled by heavy rain. I kept replaying everything in my head. My dad's silence at Thanksgiving, my aunt's smug smile when she slid those papers across the table, Nathan's grin as though he'd already won. The anger was there, burning like coals, but it was buried under layers of exhaustion and grief. Because that's what it felt like, grief. Like I had lost something I'd never really had to begin with. I thought about cutting ties completely, just packing up, disappearing, leaving no trace. I had the means. I could have gone anywhere in the world and started fresh. But then, a question crept into my mind, one I couldn't shake. Why should I be the one to leave? Why should I give them the satisfaction of driving me away from the life I'd built with my own hands? That thought lodged itself in me, stubborn, refusing to leave. Still, the suffering didn't go away overnight. At Christmas, I stayed home alone. My mom called, her voice cracking as she begged me to come, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit at that table again, not after what they'd done. I stayed in, microwaved leftovers, and watched the snow fall outside while families across the city gathered in warm, glowing rooms. The loneliness cut deep. January was worse. New Year's came and went, fireworks exploding outside my window while I sat in the dark. The text from my aunt grew sharper, more impatient. "We need to move forward, Andy. This delay is irresponsible." Nathan called once, his voice slick with false concern. "I know this is a big adjustment for you, man. But trust me, you'll feel better once you're not carrying all this weight alone." I hung up on him before he could finish. The lowest point came one evening when I caught myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection like I didn't recognize the man looking back. My eyes were sunken, dark circles etched beneath them. My shoulders slumped, my expression hollow. I looked like a shell, and for the first time, I whispered the question I'd been avoiding. What if they're right? What if I am being selfish? That thought scared me more than anything, because that was the seed they'd planted, watered with guilt and manipulation. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I almost believed it. But then something shifted. It happened quietly, like a flicker in the dark. I was sorting through old files on my desk, trying to distract myself, when I came across a crumpled receipt from years ago. It was from the tiny corner store where I used to grab cheap snacks during late-night shifts at the finance firm. On the back, in faded ink, I'd scribbled a note to myself, "Keep going. One day they'll see." I sat there, holding that scrap of paper, and it hit me. Back then, I didn't have anyone cheering me on. I didn't have support or recognition. All I had was myself. And somehow, against all odds, I'd made it here. That realization sparked something. Maybe my family would never see me for who I was. Maybe they'd never give me the validation I'd craved. But I didn't need them to. I never had. And if they thought they could break me, take from me, rewrite my story, they were wrong. From that moment, the fog began to lift, little by little. I still hurt. I still felt the sting of betrayal every time I remembered my father's silence or my aunt's greed. But beneath the pain, a new resolve started to form. I began moving differently, quietly, carefully. I started documenting everything, every text, every voicemail, every message they sent me about the trust or money. I reached out to a lawyer, not to act yet, but to understand my rights, to protect myself. I pulled my financial records tighter, securing accounts, changing passwords, locking down information they might have gotten their hands on. And though I hadn't yet decided what I would do, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them define me. Not anymore. The suffering hadn't ended. I still carried the weight every day. But beneath that weight, in the quiet hours of the night, a plan was beginning to take shape. They thought they had cornered me. They thought I was broken, pliable, ready to hand over everything. They had no idea. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that once you've been there, the climb up feels different. It's not immediate, not clean, but every small step starts to matter. For weeks I'd been drowning in the betrayal, replaying that image of my dad and aunt sliding those papers across the table. But slowly, bit by bit, I started reclaiming pieces of myself. It began with structure. I forced myself into routines. Wake up early, go for a run, eat something decent, shower, sit at my desk. At first it felt mechanical, like I was moving through molasses, but after a while, my body started to remember what discipline felt like. The fog in my head began to clear. Work, which had felt like a weight pressing me into the ground, started to feel like an escape again. I poured myself into it, focusing on projects, building new connections, and letting the noise of my family fade into the background. My lawyer gave me clarity too. I'll never forget sitting across from him in his downtown office as he scanned the messages and documents I collected. He raised an eyebrow and said, "They don't have a leg to stand on, Andy. Not legally. Everything you've built is yours, and unless you sign something over, no one can touch it." Those words were like air in my lungs. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath until then. I walked out of that office taller than I'd walked in. And then something else happened. Opportunities started rolling in. Maybe it was the new energy I was putting out, or maybe it was just timing, but within a month I had 3 new partnerships on the table, deals that could easily push my net worth even higher. I found myself sitting in glass-walled conference rooms, shaking hands with people who respected me not because of family ties or childhood reputation, but because of what I'd proven in the world. For the first time, I started to feel proud of myself. Not just quietly satisfied, but genuinely proud. Meanwhile, the family dynamic shifted in strange, almost predictable ways. My aunt grew more frantic in her messages. The cheerful tone disappeared, replaced with sharp reminders and passive-aggressive digs. "It's selfish not to use what you've been given to help others. We've already told the lawyer you'll be moving forward. Don't embarrass us by backing out now." Nathan, on the other hand, got louder in public. He started posting photos online with captions like, "Big moves coming soon. Family legacy in the works." People who didn't know the full story probably thought he was the one pulling strings. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. I didn't respond to any of it. Not yet. Instead, I invested in myself. I upgraded my apartment, not ostentatiously, but enough to feel like a place I could breathe in. I hired a trainer, started taking better care of my body, rediscovered the joy of cooking real meals instead of just surviving off takeout. Slowly, the man in the mirror stopped looking like a ghost and started looking like me again. And in the professional world, my reputation grew. I was invited to speak at an industry conference, a small one at first, then larger. Standing on stage, explaining my strategies to a room full of people who scribbled notes and asked thoughtful questions, I felt a surge of confidence I'd never known. The applause at the end wasn't just noise. It was validation that I'd built something real, something that mattered. Of course, word traveled back to the family. It always did. At Easter, my cousin texted me a photo from the dinner table, Nathan red-faced, ranting about how Andy thinks he's some big shot now. Apparently, my aunt had tried to spin my success as a family achievement again, but Nathan wasn't satisfied with crumbs. He wanted the whole feast. The image of him stewing in his own bitterness while I was out in the world carving a path for myself was satisfying, in a way. But with success came new challenges. The more visible I became, the harder they tried to wedge themselves into my narrative. My aunt showed up uninvited at my office one afternoon, her smile brittle as she said, "We really need to finalize the trust, Andy. People are asking questions." She said it like she was saving me from scandal, when in reality, she was trying to pressure me. I had security escort her out. That felt like a turning point, finally drawing a line I should have drawn years ago. My father was more complicated. He didn't push as directly as my aunt, but he tried other tactics, emotional ones. He'd call and talk about the family name, about how much it meant to him that his son had done so well. Then, with a careful pause, he'd slip in something like, "It would mean even more if you used that success to make sure Nathan's future is secure." His voice was heavy with disappointment when I didn't agree. Each time he said those things, it stung less. At first, his silence and guilt trips tore at me, but as I grew stronger, I realized something vital. I didn't need his approval anymore. I didn't need any of theirs. The more I accepted that, the freer I felt. And with that freedom came vision. I started planning for the future, not theirs, mine. I expanded my investments, launched a new project that quickly gained traction, and built a small but loyal team of people who believed in me. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to life. I was steering it. I kept the family at arm's length, but I didn't cut them off entirely. Part of me wanted to watch, to see just how far they'd go when they realized I wasn't bending. And they didn't disappoint. Rumors started circulating, whispers that I'd cheated, that I'd gotten lucky, that I'd stolen ideas. None of it stuck, but it revealed their desperation. What they didn't realize was that every step I took forward made their grip weaker. The stronger I became, the less power they had. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. By summer, my life looked almost unrecognizable compared to that bleak winter. My company was thriving, my health was better, and I was waking up with purpose again. The family's calls and texts still came, but I'd stopped letting them dictate my mood. Each manipulation attempt became fuel for me, a reminder of why I had to keep moving forward. And yet, beneath the rise, I kept my eyes on them. I knew this wasn't over. People like my aunt and cousin didn't just back down. They'd push harder, scheme bigger, until they got what they wanted, or until I stopped them for good. And so, while the surface of my life glittered with progress, beneath it, I was preparing. Quietly, patiently, because one day soon, I knew the balance would tip, and when it did, I would be ready. By the time summer melted into fall, I had grown comfortable with the distance between me and my family. They were still circling, still trying their usual tactics, but I'd learned how to weather it. Every ignored call, every unanswered text, every meeting I refused hardened me a little more. But deep down, I knew ignoring them wouldn't be enough. If I didn't act, they'd never stop. My aunt's persistence wasn't going to fizzle out. Nathan's entitlement wasn't going to vanish. My dad's silence wasn't going to magically turn into support. They would push and push until either I gave in or I pushed back. That's when the idea of revenge stopped being some fleeting thought I shoved aside and started becoming a plan. It began with information. If there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that knowledge is leverage. I already had the texts, the emails, the legal drafts they'd tried to force through. But I needed more. I needed to know exactly how far they'd gone, and more importantly, how sloppy they'd been in trying to manipulate me. One evening, while reviewing some of my accounts, I noticed something odd. A small withdrawal attempt from an unfamiliar account had been flagged and stopped by the bank. When I investigated further, the name attached to the attempt nearly made me laugh. Nathan. He'd tried to link my account information to some online trading platform, probably thinking he could dip his hands into the flow and I'd be too distracted to notice. It was amateurish, clumsy, but it told me something vital. Nathan wasn't just greedy, he was reckless. And reckless people leave trails. I hired a private investigator, not for anything extreme, but to quietly watch the situation, track movements, and pull records I couldn't access myself. Within weeks, I had a folder thicker than I expected. Credit card statements showing Nathan living far beyond his means. Records of failed business pitches, each one using my name in some way. Even a few desperate emails he'd sent to investors where he claimed to be working in partnership with me. That folder was a goldmine. Proof, not just of their manipulation, but of outright fraud. But I didn't use it immediately. I let it sit, knowing that in the right hands, at the right time, it would carry more weight than a dozen angry confrontations. While that simmered in the background, I focused on solidifying my own position. I doubled down on work, And one particular opportunity came knocking that changed everything. A major firm approached me about a joint venture, something that would elevate my name from successful entrepreneur to legitimate industry leader. It wasn't just about money. It was about influence, credibility, and a seat at the table where decisions were made. I accepted, and when the press releases went out, splashing my name across business journals and online articles, the ripple effect was immediate. Calls poured in from people who had once ignored me. Invitations to panels, offers for collaborations, even notes from politicians who suddenly wanted to connect. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just wealthy, I was powerful. And with that power came options. The family, of course, noticed instantly. My mom left me a shaky voicemail. "Your father's been reading about you in the papers. He's proud, Andy. He really is. Maybe you could stop by for dinner." I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the unspoken pressure behind the words. Proud. He was proud now, apparently, after years of silence. Now that strangers were clapping for me, my dad had decided I was worthy of the word. I didn't return her call. My aunt, however, wasn't so subtle. She stormed into my office building one afternoon, demanding to speak with me. Security held her at the front desk, but I could hear her voice echoing down the hall. "He owes us. This family made him who he is. Without us, he'd be nothing." When I finally walked out to face her, she froze, caught off guard by the fact that I wasn't hiding anymore. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "This is my building, not yours. Don't come here again." And then I turned and walked away, leaving her sputtering at the security desk. It was a small moment, but it was the first time I felt the power shift in real time. For years, I'd been the one shrinking in their presence, letting their words dictate my worth. Now, I was the one setting boundaries, and they couldn't handle it. But the real turning point came a few weeks later. I was at a networking event, speaking with a group of investors, when one of them mentioned casually, "Funny thing, I heard your cousin was pitching himself as your partner. Said you were backing his new venture. Is that true?" I smiled politely, masking the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "No," I said calmly. "That's not true. At all." But inside, a fire lit. Nathan wasn't just reckless anymore. He was encroaching on territory that could damage my reputation. If investors started believing his lies, it could unravel everything I'd worked for. That was the moment I knew I couldn't just defend myself anymore. I had to go on the offensive. The next day, I pulled out the folder the private investigator had compiled. I laid it across my desk, page after page of evidence. Fraudulent pitches, debts, lies, reckless behavior. And as I looked at it, the plan crystallized. This wasn't just about protecting myself. This was about teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. But I also knew revenge wasn't just about striking back. It was about timing, about waiting until they were at their most confident, their most certain they had control, then pulling the rug out from under them. So I stayed quiet. I let them think I was still vulnerable, still hesitant. When Nathan bragged online about his partnership with me, I didn't correct him. When my aunt told people that the trust was being finalized, I didn't deny it. I let the narrative build, let them dig themselves deeper into the hole. And in the meantime, I tightened my own defenses. Every account secured, every connection informed of the truth, every potential ally quietly brought to my side. By the time I was done, they could scream and claw all they wanted, but they'd find nothing to hold on to. I wasn't the quiet, invisible cousin anymore. I was the man with 30 million, with influence, with evidence, and with patience. And as I watched them scramble and scheme, I realized something that almost made me laugh. They still thought they were in control. They had no idea I was setting the stage for their downfall. The week I decided to act felt oddly ordinary. Gray rain against the windows, my inbox politely humming along with updates. But inside, everything was electric. All the months of collecting evidence, quietly building alliances, and fortifying my life came together like a machine that had finally reached full pressure. I didn't feel like a man about to lash out. I felt like someone finally learning to use a tool he'd been holding all along. Revenge, to me, had never been about theatrics or humiliation for humiliation's sake. It was about removing the foot they'd kept on my neck for years and making sure they couldn't pretend the ground they'd stood on was anything but shaky. First, I tightened the legal screws. My lawyer and I filed a formal cease and desist to anyone who'd been circulating my name without authorization, and we sent carefully worded notices to the investors Nathan had cold emailed, attaching corroborating documents that proved A, he had misrepresented his relationship with me, and B, several of his past claims were demonstrably false. The letters were firm, professional, and apparently boring enough that the recipients actually read them instead of ignoring them. A few folks who'd been on the fence about partnering with Nathan quietly backed away and looped me in to confirm facts. I answered them honestly and succinctly. The contrast between my calm transparency and Nathan's half-truths did more damage than any shouting match could have. Next, I used the folder from the PI like a scalpel. There was no need to fling every damaging email at once. I rationed the evidence strategically. A carefully compiled dossier went to the compliance officer of a regional bank where Nathan had tried to open accounts using my name, and to an independent journalist I'd met at a conference months earlier. Someone who covered small-scale fraud and family business dramas without the sensationalism that ruins careers. I didn't ask for a hit piece. I asked for accuracy and context. The journalist Doug asked questions, and when he came back with a list of corroborated facts, I allowed him to publish a measured piece. No hyperbole, just the truth laid bare. Examples of false claims, documented attempts to mislead investors, and the legal steps my team had taken to protect me. Watching that article go live felt less like revenge and more like cleaning up a house that had been full of smoke. People read it. People who mattered read it. Investors started reaching out, not because they wanted to gawk, but because they were concerned about their own exposure. That ripple effect was the second wave. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I secured the practical things. Accounts restructured, signature authorities reviewed, estate documents updated and hidden from the grubby reach of curious relatives. I transferred control of sensitive holdings into a trust structure that required more than a familial wink to access. I changed passwords, tightened two-factor authentication, and, this part felt deliciously petty, reclaimed domain names Nathan had squatted on that used my brand. All the while I kept my voice measured in public. I never posted screenshots or started a family group blow-up. I refused the drama. My silence was louder than anything they could manufacture. Their impatience showed in small ways. My aunt sending ever more desperate texts about finalizing arrangements. Nathan posting vague, smug updates that read like the last gasps of someone trying to look stable while the floor dropped out under him. They were so convinced they could bully me back into compliance that they didn't see the net I was weaving. Then I used my leverage with people who had previously been useful to them. I called in favors I'd earned, old colleagues who now sat on boards, a former mentor who had influence with a local tech incubator, a lawyer who owed me a favor from a deal years prior. I didn't ask them to stomp on my family. I asked them to simply be available, to corroborate facts, and to be ready should the situation require formal statements. Having respected, neutral third parties lined up made the move I planned look less like a vendetta and more like a series of responsible, documented responses. That was important because revenge that looks petty gets shrugged off. Revenge that looks like accountability sticks. The final piece was timing and the one thing you can't manufacture: surprise. I wanted to wait until Nathan was at his most exposed, when he had publicly leaned into the narrative that my money was his to use, when the family had convinced themselves the trust was inevitable, then pull a single, calm lever that would force them to confront reality all at once. I picked Thanksgiving again, not because I loved the symbolism, but because everyone would be there. The aunt who'd stitched her confidence from other people's success, the cousins who clustered like opportunists, my father who liked the theater of silence, and Nathan, who loved a crowd. I emailed a short note to my dad, my aunt, and Nathan 3 days before. A brief, surprisingly cordial invitation to coffee. The words were neutral. Let's talk in person about family and next steps. But the subtext was surgical. It baited them without screaming. On the morning I scheduled, I did something else that felt almost ceremonial. I printed a copy of the PI folder and placed it in a plain envelope. That physical object had a certain gravity that a folder on a server didn't. It was tactile proof of all the small, ugly things they'd done, and I wanted to watch what they would do when the paper hit the table. I also printed a separate, much shorter packet. Legal summaries, the journalist's article, emails confirming my security freezes, and kept that in my briefcase, ready to hand to any neutral party who asked for verification. When I arrived at the cafe, my hands were steady. I had rehearsed nothing. Rehearsing makes things feel like performances, and I wanted everything to feel like the truth. My dad was there first, already nursing a coffee he didn't touch. He looked older to me, smaller somehow, like the energy that used to fill him had leaked out. My aunt arrived breathless, with that practiced smile that had always been stadium bright and razor sharp at the same time. Nathan came last, late, like he was making an entrance, and he flopped into the chair across from me, a grin that tried too hard. We exchanged the expected small talk about weather and work. My voice didn't shake when I finally said what everyone already knew in some corner of their mind. I don't want the trust. I haven't signed anything, and I won't. My dad's face pinched. My aunt's smile thinned to a line of paper. Nathan's laugh, too loud, too strained, faded like a radio being turned down. Then, calmly, I slid the plain envelope across the table. No fanfare, just the soft whisper of paper on wood. I want you to read this, I said. It's everything I've collected over the last year about attempts to misrepresent my name, about claims that have been made to investors, and about your attempts to control my assets without my consent. My aunt's hand trembled as she took the envelope. Nathan started to protest, something about betrayal, about me ruining family, but I cut him off. You started this by assuming anything I had was up for grabs. You escalated it by lying to people who trusted me. You could have asked. You could have been honest. I heard a chair scrape. The cafe's clatter seemed to rush in after that. And then my father spoke, quiet, which made his words hit harder. Andy, we only wanted what was best for the family. I let that hang. Best for the family, I thought. And for whom exactly? For Nathan, who'd never written a check for anyone but himself. For my aunt, who thought motherhood granted license to rewrite a grown man's life. I waited as they read, eyes scanning, fingers tracing lines. I watched the color drain from Nathan's face. I watched my aunt's jaw clench like she was trying to hold words in. And then, just as the tension reached a point where it felt like the whole room might crack, my phone buzzed. A single email preview popped on the screen, subject line, urgent, request for verification, investor name. My heart thudded, but I kept my face neutral. The moment had arrived. The first of the dominoes I'd set in motion was tipping. I didn't have to yell or parade their misdeeds on social media. I didn't have to dole out humiliations. The evidence was out there now. The right people were asking the right questions. Legal notices were active. The banks had been informed. What I didn't expect, though, and what made my fingers go cold, was the look Nathan gave me then. Not fury, not sorrow, but a frantic, betrayed kind of calculation. He'd finally realized that this wasn't about begging or schmoozing. This was about real, irreversible consequences. He reached for his phone like a man clinging to a raft. My aunt's eyes met mine, not pleading but bargaining silently. Make it stop. I could have stopped. I could have folded the papers back into the envelope and returned to the life I'd had before, the one where I smiled at family photos and accepted their little digs. But years of walking with my head down had taught me a different lesson. When people show you who they are, believe them. I sat back and watched the first email open on my phone. The sender wanted confirmation that the investments Nathan had been pitching were not backed by me. They needed a statement. I could type a sentence and end a campaign of lies with one signature. I could also forward the journalist's contact and every corroborating document we'd compiled and let the story expand beyond anything my family could salvage with a spin. I spent a long, charged second deciding. Around us, other patrons were oblivious, students with laptops, a couple arguing about rent, the barista steaming milk. The ordinary life of the world churned on, which made the impending rupture feel both absurd and inevitable. Then Nathan spoke, very low, the kind of voice you use when trying to negotiate with a volcano. Andy, please. Don't do this at Thanksgiving. Not like this. Give us a chance to. He didn't finish. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time a simple line from the journalist. Sources confirm more. Need your go-ahead to publish full piece. The cafe air seemed to narrow. I looked at my father. I looked at my aunt. I looked at Nathan. I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking, about the nights of doubt, about the legal drafts on the table that had been slid across without my consent. I thought about the way they'd all laughed at my paperwork job when I was 20 and about how different the world looked now that I'd spent a decade building something real. My thumb hovered over the reply button. I could give them one last chance, an olive branch that would probably net me nothing and leave them free to try again. Or I could let the dossier speak, let neutral people read the facts, and allow events to unfold in daylight rather than in whispered deals behind closed doors. I inhaled, steady, the rain smell creeping through the cafe door, and hit send on the email that would confirm the journalist's request. The message left my outbox in a soft whoosh, and whatever music that had been playing in my head stopped. For a moment, a single, suspended heartbeat, I felt something like relief. Then my phone lit up with incoming replies, a terse thank you from the journalist, a curt note from the investor that they'd put Nathan's pitches on hold, and, finally, a string of texts in the family group chat that made my palms sweat. Frantic, accusatory, pleading, denial. Nathan looked at the glowing phone screen, then at me, and the expression he wore was not the spoiled boy I remembered, but someone tasting immediate, naked panic for the first time. He reached across the table as if to snatch the printed dossier back toward him, perhaps hoping to reframe or fabricate, but my hand was already on my briefcase. I wasn't going to be bullied into silence. I let him lunge and miss, and as his fingertips brushed empty air, the cafe seemed to tilt. Outside, a delivery truck rolled by, blowing a wet gust of wind that flapped napkins on nearby tables. Inside, my aunt pressed her lips together like someone expecting to be slapped. My father's hands had turned to fists. Nathan's phone screen reflected in his eyes, a little window of the life he'd tried to commandeer, and then his face hardened into something I barely recognized. He stood up abruptly, the chair screeching, almost knocking into a woman across the aisle. "This isn't over," he said, voice small but trying for menace, and before I could answer, he stormed out. My aunt followed, dragging her coat like armor. My father remained seated, hands on the table, looking older than I'd ever seen him, and for a second I thought I caught something almost like shame. The journalist sent another message. "Publishing tomorrow morning unless you advise otherwise." That simple line was the fuse. I felt the starting pistons of whatever would come next: court filings, media attention, family members called to account. I also felt, beneath it all, a quiet steadiness I'd earned, the knowledge that I had not lashed out in anger, but had instead used the rules of the world, law, journalism, contracts, to expose the truth. I walked out of the cafe into the wet afternoon and stood beneath a streetlight, watching Nathan's taillights disappear. My phone vibrated again, a message from my mother. 2 words, trembling with everything she'd never said aloud before. "Please, Andy." I read it, thumb hovering over the reply, and in that instant I knew that whatever happened after the article dropped would change everything. I also knew I couldn't unknow what I'd learned about them, and they couldn't unknow the truth that was about to be broadcast. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time I left the block. I tucked my head into my collar and started walking, not toward the house where family waited and tension simmered, but away. I had set the dominoes in motion. Some would fall quickly, others would take time. I had done the math, pulled the strings, and prepared the papers. What I hadn't done was decide exactly how I would face them when the first story hit, whether I would sit at that Thanksgiving table and watch, or whether I would let them squirm from a distance while I rebuilt a life they tried to claim. My phone buzzed again, but this time the message was anonymous, and it read, "You just made a lot of enemies." I smiled without humor, because at that moment it felt like the truest compliment I'd ever received. Then my screen went dark as the battery icon winked red. I kept walking into the rain, and as I rounded the corner toward the subway, my mind ran through the steps in the sequence I'd rehearsed 100 times. The first article would publish at 9 a.m. The investors would put Nathan's proposals on hold. Banks and compliance teams would open inquiries. People who'd been complicit would try to distance themselves. And at some point, soon, the family would have to look at the consequences of what they had done and decide whether to beg, deny, or stand and take responsibility. I almost wanted to be there when that decision was made. I almost wanted to watch the theater of it all. But there was one final thing to do before the dominoes fully fell. A private conversation I had to have with one person who had the most to lose. A conversation that would determine whether remorse might still be possible, or whether the final curtain would drop on any chance of reconciliation. I paused on the steps of the station, rain streaming down my face, and sent one last text to a number I'd only ever used for emergencies. The message was simple: "Meet me tomorrow. Noon. Old Pier. Come alone." I hit send, slid the phone back into my pocket, and descended into the tunnel, the sound of the city above me muffled. The truth was loose now, and everything that followed would be the fallout. The article dropped the next morning at 9 a.m. sharp, just like the journalist promised. By 9:15, my phone was buzzing nonstop. At first, I thought I'd feel nervous, like I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, but instead, I felt calm. The piece was clean, factual, and devastating. It laid out the schemes Nathan had run, the lies he'd told, the reckless fraud he'd committed while invoking my name. It quoted compliance officers, included screenshots of his emails, and even mentioned that legal measures were already in motion. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't embellish. It just showed the truth, in black and white, for everyone to see. The fallout was immediate. By noon, Nathan's so-called business partners were cutting ties. Calls I didn't even know he had been making were suddenly rerouted to me. Investors scrambling to confirm what was real and what wasn't. I answered everyone with the same line. I have no connection to his ventures. The documents speak for themselves. Calm, steady, undeniable. By 2 p.m., Nathan's social media accounts had gone dark. The smug posts, the vague boasts about big family-backed projects, all vanished. But screenshots circulated anyway. People laughed at how quickly he'd backpedaled. My inbox was full of links from acquaintances forwarding me threads where people were tearing him apart, investors calling him reckless, opportunists calling him exposed. And by evening, the calls from my family began. My aunt was first. She left a voicemail that swung wildly between anger and desperation. How could you do this to your own blood? You've humiliated us. You think strangers care about you more than your family? You've destroyed Nathan's future. Her voice cracked on the last line, and then, almost whispering, "Please, Andy, we can fix this. We can fix this." I didn't reply. My father called next. His message was quieter, heavier. "Son, this was too much. You didn't have to go this far." But then, in a pause so long I thought he'd hung up, he added, I should have handled this differently." That was the closest he'd ever come to admitting fault, and it still wasn't enough. For the first time, their words didn't pierce me. They felt small, distant, powerless. The next few days were chaos in the family orbit. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years texted me, some pretending to be supportive, others fishing for gossip. My mother called, sobbing, begging me to make peace. But there was no peace to be made. Not after they'd plotted to take everything from me, and not after they'd been exposed for exactly who they were. Nathan tried to fight back at first. He released a shaky video online, claiming the article was biased, that I had set him up, that he was the real victim of betrayal. But his eyes gave him away, wild, frantic, terrified. Within hours, comments shredded him to pieces. Receipts don't lie. Bro, you literally used his name in fake pitches. Own up, man. He deleted the video before the sun set. Meanwhile, I kept moving. My company thrived. My influence grew. People admired not the spectacle, but how calmly I'd handled it. No mudslinging, no theatrics, just letting the truth dismantle the lies. In an industry where credibility is everything, that mattered. The family, however, crumbled. Nathan lost his access to credit. Banks froze his accounts after the fraud attempts surfaced. His girlfriend left him, posting vague quotes about betrayal and realizing someone isn't who you thought they were. My aunt, once the loudest voice in every room, went quiet. Her friends stopped inviting her to brunch when her bragging turned into bitter complaints. And my father, he withdrew, avoiding me, avoiding everyone, retreating into a silence even heavier than before. I didn't celebrate their collapse. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't save them. They had written this story themselves. I had simply stopped erasing the ink. Months later, the holidays came again. I didn't attend the family dinner. Instead, I hosted my own gathering. Friends, colleagues, people who had supported me when my family tried to break me. Laughter filled my home, warm and real, no masks, no hidden agendas. At one point, I caught myself standing in the doorway, watching the glow of conversation and clinking glasses, and I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. That night, as the party wound down, I stepped out onto the balcony. Snow drifted in the quiet air, catching in the city lights. My phone buzzed once more, a message from an unknown number. It was from Nathan. Just 3 words. "You ruined me." I stared at the screen, the snow falling soft around me. For a long moment, I considered replying. A dozen words rose in my throat. Defenses, explanations, even a touch of pity. But I deleted them all. Instead, I powered off the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and turned back inside, where real laughter waited. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I wasn't shrinking in anyone's shadow. I wasn't an asset, or a pawn, or the quiet cousin forgotten at the table. I was simply Andy, whole, steady, and free. And that was enough.